All right, so we should be recording now. Um, I will say in advance, this presentation is going to be a little lighter than the other ones because I had a lot less time to make it than we normally do. So just letting you all know that in advance. But I'm going to start off with just talking about what a diagnosis is. It's when you have some kind of abnormal experiences, some behavior that doesn't line up with what with like a system of expected behaviors, typically in medical expectations of ability, and by categorizing those differences with similar differences from other people, you put those into categories, into disorders or conditions or whatever, and the process of finding where a given person fits into those categories based on abnormalities or symptoms is a diagnosis. I think personally, diagnoses are a really interesting thing because there's kind of an implication that the categories that you place people into are supposed to represent like the true nature of the symptoms or cause of the symptoms from a deeper place. It's like you being in the category causes the behaviors, not the other way around. At least that's that's how the language is rhetorically used oftentimes. I'm going to be using autism as an example for a lot of this because I think it's a good one, especially in context of a lot of like contemporary media conversations around self-diagnosis are surrounding autism, at least within the past few years. With autism, the language people tend to use is not that somebody has autism because they have maybe sensory difficulties or difficulties with processing speed, or there's tons of symptoms, but it's the language is as if having autism causes the symptoms, even though it's a category that people made up to describe what's to describe observed behavior. And the reason that distinction is important, at least to me, is because it highlights how doctors and psychologists have a lot of cultural power on how people interpret their bodies, interpret their social environment. In a way, they can kind of they have a authority through expertise to describe reality of how of like why your body is the way it is based on these categories of that they place people in with diagnoses. I'm not trying when I say that I'm not trying to say that diagnoses are useless. They're absolutely not. Uh, there's institutional reasons why, obviously, because a lot of workplaces or schools or government programs don't actually accommodate you unless that institutional expertise approves it with something like an official diagnosis through the medical system. Um, there's also obviously insurance that often requires diagnoses to cover certain kinds of healthcare. Insurance companies are very deeply invested in maintaining the authority of medical systems. If the hospitals aren't making money, the insurance companies aren't making money. So they would rather you get diagnosed in order to, one, gatekeep what kind of things that they will and won't cover. Yeah, that's actually, I don't know why I said both. Yeah, that's pretty much it. It's just a money thing for the most part. Um, and also, even on a personal level, putting a standardized label on something, it can help doctors find ways to help a patient through diagnosis, help doctors communicate with each other through shorthand. If you say, oh, somebody is in this category of experience, then they can go out and communicate with other doctors to find healthcare treatment plans or medications or surgeries or whatever it is that might work for somebody. Also, that those labels can help people find others with similar experiences that they can use to learn from and build, accommodations into their own personal lives that they wouldn't have otherwise. And that brings me to my last thing, is that it can feel good to know that your experiences aren't alone, that there are other people like you who share some level of that there's some level of like shared experience or existence between you and other people. There's, I think for a lot of people, myself definitely included, there can be a sense of comfort from knowing that, from feeling like you don't make sense in the world of other people, and then finding out that actually you do make sense, and reality has a place for you, whether defined by institutions or just defined by your relationships with other people. That can help people feel like they belong. And that's a really good thing most of the time. It's also really expensive to get an official diagnosis. This is probably the most prohibitive barrier. Healthcare costs a lot. With the autism example, autism diagnoses, as far as I know, or, and somebody maybe can correct me, are about, without insurance, about $2,000. And without not everybody will take your insurance, even if you have it. There's a high monetary barrier for entry to go through medical institutions to get diagnosed. Also, sometimes doctors are only familiar with like a certain subset of symptoms for something that might be based on outdated information, might be actively exclusionary or discriminatory. For the autism example again, there's when that disorder was first being kind of conceived of, mostly uh, cis white upper middle class boys were studied to get a sense of what those symptoms look like. And that means for people from cultures surrounding non-white ethnicities, from people who are not children or not socialized as boys, those symptoms are a lot less understood. And it makes that categorization, at least as far as an official diagnosis from doctors is concerned, sometimes not accurate to how similar people's experiences with what autism is supposed to represent are. That can be a big problem when misdiagnoses happen, and it can be deeply unhelpful for people. Self-diagnoses um, doesn't confer all of the advantages of normal diagnosis, particularly the ones that rely on the institutional power and expertise of the medical system, like communicating with an insurance company or a government agency, things like that. But understanding your own experiences in context of what you know about a disorder or a condition can help people find treatments on their own to build accommodations into their life and deal with impairments more easily, because they have some kind of solid foundation that they've kind of built for themselves. Also, labels around diagnoses are not just used to describe medical phenomena, but they're also used to signify belonging to communities. And especially in communities of people that have more monetary barriers for access diagnoses, or where those biases on behalf of the doctors would be a lot more pronounced, than the self-diagnosis as a way to build community and find people that are similar to you can be a really great tool. And I think it's a tool that has, I'm gonna spend a little bit of time talking about the modern context of self-diagnosis, because as a public widespread discussion point, it's a very new thing that these conversations about self-diagnosis have been as mainstream as they are. And I kind of want to break that down, analyze it a little bit because I think it's interesting, and I want to talk about it if other people do after this. Obviously, the internet has a huge effect on how people engage with each other and engage with information, and how people determine who is and isn't an authority figure on something. One of the big things that kind of the popularization and ubiquity of the internet from like the mid 90s to mid 2010s has had is that there's a lot of ecosystems that exist within internet spaces that thrive off of explaining psychology and explaining medicine to people who are not professionals in those areas. And the internet positions those kinds of ecosystems to reach a much wider audience than they ever could otherwise. So the result is a lot of people are a lot more aware of these concepts of psychology or disability or whatever it is now than they could have been 40 years ago, for example, at least not as widely. Social media algorithms also prioritize broad appeal and virality, and that means that content creators who are either talking about or like actively creating content around niche experiences like certain mental illnesses, for example, in order to find an audience, have to be accessible to a mainstream audience to get traction. So it prioritizes kind of making that content around these subjects that might not apply to a broad audience in theory. In order to be successful, they kind of have to. So a lot of content around mental health, around um, mental disorders, and increasingly around disability is reaching a wider and wider audience, in my opinion, largely as a result of how social media algorithms are pushing people to interact with them. Disabled and neurodivergent people can also communicate through internet-based content in a way that's difficult to in real life. Housebound people, for example, have a certain avenue of self-expression that wouldn't have been available before. And also communities a lot, non-local community is a lot easier to find in virtual spaces. There's, I think I talked about it in the queer disability presentation, but often queer people and disabled people aren't surrounded by people who share those experiences within their local community. So they have to go out of their way often to find each other. And with the internet reaching new levels of mainstream ubiquity in the past 20 years, that process of building community with people that share similar experiences to you is no longer limited to just the people in front of you. And so that process of categorizing yourself with kind of other people's experiences and all of the benefits that come from that now can happen without the aid of medical institutions, at least on the community building end, in a way that wasn't as possible before the internet. I don't want to spend a lot of time. I deliberately didn't make slides about this because I knew I would like go on a tangent. But I also think I've spent a lot of time talking about the internet. I don't think that that's the only reason this has entered into, like, I guess, mainstream discourse conversation. The self-diagnosis, at least in my view, is following a broader cultural trend of the kind of reconfiguring older structures and information and media into new structures and new forms that, broadly, it's a very broad thing that's happening in art and philosophy. I also think that the increasing disregard in some ways for medical authority and kind of attaching expertise and significance to more niche communities in good and bad ways over the past 30 years or so is also a reflection of that. Could be something interesting to talk about later. I don't know. There's a lot of people that don't like self-diagnosis as a thing, and I want to. There's some ideas I personally don't take seriously, but some I really do want to kind of talk about and engage with critically. A lot of people oppose the cultural shift in how the medical institutions and how diagnoses and how disability are socially understood because of an investment in not having that cultural understanding change. A lot of people are very invested in the security of their sense of reality, in the sense that they find comfort in a lack of change. So when these cultural shifts brought on by art or technology or whatever make people start to communicate about things differently, people can become defensive. And there's, in at least from my observations, an undercurrent of a lot of like mainstream opposition to self-diagnosis, that people are denying reality by bypassing medical institutions and by kind of getting more of their expertise and information not through academia and going through the process of getting a degree and working in the field or whatever, but from the internet and from social media. There's also another side to this that I think is more interesting. The opposition in some of these communities to self-diagnosis that, from my observations, can sometimes come from wanting to gatekeep the community from outsiders, from people that either aren't as oppressed or as disabled as somebody, or wanting or buying into that idea that a medical institution will group people together in functional and productive ways. Found a couple examples of that. There's this one. It's a lot of text, but it's basically saying that it's resenting that a lot of people who, a lot of like white people who are have a lot of white privilege based on their race, claiming that some people self-diagnose to kind of have an oppressed identity, to separate themselves from their privilege, instead of using that privilege to uplift the voices of people who, in their opinion, are really oppressed. Yeah, there it is. This one is a Reddit post I found talking about how if somebody's misinformed on a diagnosis and is saying that they have similar experiences to other people with that diagnosis, then that misinformation can spread and end up changing how a community operates, using the example of from themselves as an autistic person who thought they had schizophrenia, that if they went around telling people that I have schizophrenia, then other people might come to think that schizophrenia means something that it doesn't, and that would hurt the ability for schizophrenic people to be widely understood. There are some dangers of it that, in my opinion, are more valid that I just wanted to highlight real quick before we're finished. A lot of this is a flaw that's also shared with doctors, but I think it needs to be said because I pointed it out earlier for medical institutions that can be run off of like outdated or biased information. That can also happen when people are looking for information about themselves on the internet or through social media or even through the like other non-internet based communities of people with certain conditions. Also, I think it's important to point out that we're all approaching this as college educated people who have had a certain kind of exposure to research and to education that not everybody does have. I think in a lot of ways, uh, people in um, institutions like OSU are protected from a lot of the pitfalls that self-diagnosis can pose to people, because if you don't necessarily know what to look for, don't have a baseline foundation of how to navigate um, of how to navigate like what information to trust and what doesn't. There's a lot of opportunists and grifters that uh, make money off of telling people, I know how to fix what's going on with you. And if you give me your money, I can give you either something that won't work or something that will actively hurt you to fix whatever problem you're having about yourself. Last one I want to mention before we get into discussions. This is an interesting one. So there was a article I found from 2019 that um, going over uh, apparently huge issue in the UK at the time, where people, according to at least that research, about a fifth of people who went to the doctors were incorrectly self-diagnosing themselves based on things that they saw on the internet. Now, the correct self-diagnosis was also based on medical professionals who could also be working on from bad information. But I think the worst part of that is that um, a good number of that 20% were turned away and then still had to pay for a doctor's appointment. I think the figure was that they spent the UK's medical system lost about $500 million that year to, or not that the system lost, but that there were $500 million of kind of redundant funds that represent the time of patients and the time of doctors put in. That's money that people are paying the institutions. So a lot of times, if people are wrong about something, that can maybe be a problem. I'm not entirely sure because, again, I didn't have a lot of time to make this. So I would have done more research on that, but I just found it interesting. So I wanted to put it in. And yeah, I'm just want to say, like, I am personally very like writing from a place of, I think self-diagnosis is fine and a good thing. Totally chill if people disagree, and we can talk about that.
We have a couple comments in the chat. So one is that quality medical information is often gatekept through expensive medical journals and inaccessible jargon. Accessible and quality information is so important. And then also, a lot of the dangers of self-diagnosis also stem from stigma already surrounding diagnoses, mental health concerns, and disabilities.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't have much to add. Both of those things I wholeheartedly agree with, and I hope everybody else does too. So yeah, here's I just, if people need discussion questions to know where to start, I have some of them here. Have you ever self-diagnosed something for yourself? Do you think there are any valid criticisms of people self-diagnosing? I personally know there are a lot of invalid ones, but uh, I don't know. I'm interested to hear what people have to say. Also wondering what people think is the best way to spread awareness of our experiences. A lot of this conversation, not just from what I talked about, but in, I guess, the media at large, is surrounding how these kind of changes in technology change how people are made aware of these conditions. So people might have opinions about that. And also, what role do people think medical institutions should or shouldn't play in how people understand themselves, and separately how people get treatment and the tools to overcome whatever impairments they might be facing?
We have someone in the chat wondering, what's your opinion on peer-reviewed diagnosis when friends agree that you have a condition?
Peer-reviewed diagnosis when friends are, oh, that's I'm gonna stop the recording and then